Hi there again, Social Studies 30-1. Going to study corruption in democracies. So, no one ever said democracy was a perfect system. No one ever said it was the political be-all, end-all to society's solutions for law and order. It has some warts. It has some issues that go with it. And one of those issues, among others, is corruption. We're going to take a look at three examples, case studies of corruption in democracies today, two involving Canada and one that you've probably heard of involving American democracy. Um, Corruption in a democracy would involve a government putting itself above the rule of law. Now, it's not going to percolate into a genocide or an ethnic cleansing like we've looked at in authoritarian systems. It won't even get to the point of mass murder. But corruption in democracy is when a government puts itself above the rule of law and it's not being transparent with the public like it's supposed to. It's not being accountable to the public like it's supposed to. It's putting its own self-interest first, and it's not serving the people that voted for it in the first place. So the first example we'll look at is the Canadian sponsorship scandal. This is back in the 1990s before you were born, so you probably don't remember. But ask your parents about it because they probably would remember John Chrétien and the sponsorship scandal. To give you a bit of an historical time frame, it's the 1990s. Uh, I had just started teaching at this time, and this politically was the peak of the Quebec separatist movement. And so in the mid 90s, they'll actually have a national referendum, a national or a provincial vote on whether or not Quebec should separate from Canada. And the vote was really close. 49% of people that voted in Quebec voted in favor of leaving, and 51% voted in favor of staying, so they stayed. But it was a very close vote, and it looked very much like Quebec was on the brink of leaving Canada. And as much, sometimes we get tired of hearing Quebec complain, and sometimes we think we don't care if they went. You don't want them to, in that if Quebec was to separate, it would be a sign of Canada beginning to disintegrate and the value of the dollar would drop. I know that back in the mid 90s that the dollar was, the loonie was in one case even below 70 cents US because of the threat of Quebec separatism, among other things. So it's better if they stay. And at the time, it looked like they were on the verge of going. So to try and draw them back into the fold of Canada, John Chrétien uh, gave companies, private companies, millions of dollars to promote Canada in Quebec. And so, what I mean by this, the Chrétien government would give advertising firms and things like that millions of dollars to put up posters and signs and billboards advertising Canada to Quebec to get Quebec to stay, making commercials, putting ads in newspapers and magazines, billboards and so on. All of this with the intent of trying to sell Canada to Quebec. Look, you don't want to leave Quebec. You want to stay. You want to be part of Canada. And so what made it a scandal was that there was no bidding for this money. And what I mean by that is that typically when a government um, hires private firms to do something, there's a bidding process. Sometimes it's even a bidding war. And so what that means is that companies that would like to get this money and make this investment would bid a price with the government. So company A might say, listen, we'll do it for X amount of dollars. And company B might say, we'll do it for X amount of dollars. And company C and so on. And so the government will then look at these bids and say, all right, well, based on what we see here, these guys are the cheapest. Let's go with them. Or based on what we see here, these guys are the cheapest and they've got the best track record. Let's go with them. In this case, what made this a scandal is there was no bidding. The government gave money to, it looked like, companies that they were friends with. Um, there was no bidding war. There was no bidding process. Private companies were given millions of dollars without bidding, and that's bad enough. What made it worse was that most of the work was never even started, let alone completed. So it almost looked like money was given to friends of the Chrétien government, and they just kept the money and put it in their pocket. and didn't bother to do any of the work. The intent might have been they were never going to start, but for the most part, they didn't. A lot of the money went to companies that had been loyal Liberal supporters. In other words, they'd given money to the Liberal Party during federal elections, and a lot of Canadians saw this as just rewarding people that supported the Liberal Party. It wasn't really serving the public because it was bad enough. It was given to friends of the government. To make it worse, the project, the work never started anyway or was completed. There was an investigation. The RCMP were involved. I mean, after all, this is fraud. Someone could go to jail for this. The Globe and Mail exposed it. It led to the Gomery Commission report. All in all, it cost taxpayers about $14 million. None of the work was ever done. Chrétien was implicated himself. He was the prime minister at the time. And some people even went to jail, although Chrétien escaped legal prosecution and he never went to jail. The corruption, the scandal was so bad. I mean, among other things, that this wasn't the only one of the 1990s. There were more, but people were just so fed up with the government that in 2006 the Liberal government was annihilated in the federal election and almost went extinct in that 2006 federal election, and that was the end of John Chrétien. He had been the Prime Minister of Canada through most of the 1990s and early 2000s. You could argue that he had become unaccountable because he always won the elections. He was putting his own self-interest first and clearly was going above the rule of law. So there's example number one. Example number two, you probably heard of. This is fresh. This was just last year. This is the Trudeau SNC Lavalin affair of 2019. Just last year around this time, this story was broken. It's a little complicated, so bear with me, and it's highly interesting. The story, well, no, not the story, the allegations, the evidence, the proof goes like this, because all of this was proven. Um, a Quebec engineering firm, SNC Lavalin, was facing charges for fraud and corruption because they'd paid nearly $48 million to Libyan government officials as part of bribery and scandal in Libya between 2001 and 2011. And so this Quebec engineering firm SNC Lavalin was already in trouble and was facing legal prosecution for fraud and corruption with the Libyan government between 2001 and 2011. If Lavalin was convicted, what it would mean is that they would be blocked from competing for federal government contracts for the next 10 years. So it would mean that they could not bid on federal government contracts for at least a decade in Canada. And so uh, Prime Minister Trudeau pressured the Justice Minister, and you probably heard of her, Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Canadian Justice Minister at the time. He pressured her to drop the charges against SNC Lavalin. And what he was pressuring her to do was a deferred prosecution agreement that the Trudeau government had implemented a few years earlier. And so what this agreement would do, this amendment, would allow big companies, certain companies handpicked by the government, it would allow these companies to escape criminal charges such as bribery, fraud, and corruption. A deferred prosecution agreement. So it's kind of an end around the legal process. So rather than the leaders of these companies, going to jail for criminal charges, um, they would just be not allowed to bid on government contracts as their punishment, rather than having all those people go to jail. And the thinking being was that, if a few bad apples in that company do something wrong like bribery and corruption, and they go out of business because of it, or it costs people jobs, it would hurt employees and customers and people that depend on that company. So Trudeau's justification for pressuring Wilson Raybould was this: if SNC Lavalin is found guilty, it would mean that the contracts they have in Canada with the Canadian government would also be null and void. and all the people that work for that company would now be out of jobs. It could cost hundreds, maybe even thousands of people their jobs in Canada. So, in Trudeau's defense, and he even said this, I'm not going to apologize for this. Um, uh, these are Trudeau's words. I'm not going to apologize. I did this for the betterment of Canada. I did this to save Canadian jobs. Now, whether that's true, who knows? But we do know that he pressured Wilson Raybould when she refused to grant Lavalin the deferred prosecution agreement. He demoted her to Minister of Indian Affairs of Canada. Later on, she resigned from cabinet, and Trudeau eventually kicked her out of the Liberal Party altogether, which he can do as the leader of that party. So to a lot of Canadians, this was, and it is a scandal. Like, this is a political scandal to pressure the Justice Minister to get her to overlook, criminal affairs because people in that company, or you're trying to protect the economy. All of that notwithstanding, he was getting in the way of justice. He was caught too. This was broken by the Globe and Mail in the spring just last year. And it was a bad timing for Justin Trudeau because, as you know, there was a fall election on the horizon, and this isn't something that you want following you around. There was an investigation, and after a 6-month long investigation, the ethics commissioner, we talked about the ethics commissioner last week, concluded that Trudeau had contravened Section 9 of the Federal Conflict of Interest Act by pressuring Wilson Raybould. Um, and he would go on to say that while she was never officially directed to interfere, it was pretty obvious that she was being pressured to interfere, just not in so many words. Um, Trudeau was never sanctioned or punished in any way because technically, according to Dion, he didn't really break the law outright, but it was still scandalous. I mean, eh, it's one thing to pressure the justice minister. It's another to demote her and kick her out of the party because she wouldn't go along with what you wanted as the leader of the country. It looked bad, but as you know, the Liberals won the fall election anyway, so maybe people forgot, or we've just come to expect this in democracy. Because I do remember some people saying, well, that happens in every democracy. Um, but it shouldn't, because it's wrong, because it's a government putting itself above the rule of law. And that clearly happened in the Lavalin affair. Finally, our third example you've probably heard of, especially if you've seen Forrest Gump, the Watergate scandal of the 1970s. So this was in 1972. What happened was Richard Nixon was up for re-election in an American federal election, and he was caught. He was implicated with prowlers who were caught wiretapping phones and stealing documents of their political opponents, the Democrats. Nixon was Republican. And this happened in the Watergate Hotel. So people were caught wiretapping phones of Nixon's political opposition. Um, they were stealing documents of Nixon's political opposition because they were trying to dig up dirt to use against that opposition to help Nixon in the election. But he was caught. The conspiracy was revealed in 1974, and on the eve of being impeached, because they were going to impeach Richard Nixon, on the eve of his impeachment, he voluntarily resigned to avoid the humiliation of impeachment. And to this day, when people think or see Nixon, or think of Nixon, they think of the Watergate scandal. Um, because that was, again, an out and out circumvention of democracy. He had gone above the rule of law. He was putting his own self-interest first. He was breaking the law and was sure to be impeached if he hadn't resigned. And so these three examples don't involve mass murder. They don't involve horrible things like the Nuremberg laws. What they involve is corruption and scandal in democracy, and that weakens democracy. If people over time begin to think that they can't trust their politicians, well, that doesn't lead to a healthy democratic environment. Democracy, it's got to be built on trust. It's got to be built on accountability. It's got to be built on our leaders putting what is best for the country first. and their own self-interest, well down the list. And when people see examples of scandal and lack of rule of law, we begin to question democracy. And if this happens enough, and it probably has already started, they start to get uninvolved in the democratic process. They stop voting, and we'll look at evidence of that. They stop paying attention to the democratic process because they're thinking, well, I can't trust these guys anyway. It doesn't matter who I vote for, they're all crooked. That really weakens democracy. I don't blame people for thinking that, but that's what weakens democracy. We need to be vigilant. We need to be involved in the democratic process to make sure that this doesn't happen. Because if we let it happen, and we have an undemocratic leader and we're aware of that, we've really only got ourselves to blame for letting them get reelected. Hope this was helpful. Stay tuned for further lessons.